If you talk to the men who flew in the Great Crusade, they'll tell you there was a specific sound that changed the course of history. It wasn't the whistle of a falling bomb. It was the rhythmic, guttural roar of a Packard-built Merlin engine appearing where it was never supposed to be. For the veteran Experten of the Luftwaffe, men who had survived years of dogfights, 1944 brought a cold, terrifying realization. The little friends they used to watch turn back at the border weren't leaving anymore. In fact, they were hunting. Today, we're looking at the exact moment the hunter became the prey, and how a single American fighter broke the spirit of the German Air Force. For the first few years of the air war over Europe, the German Luftwaffe operated under a comforting, if arrogant, mathematical certainty. They believed in the iron ceiling, an invisible line over the Rhine that no Allied fighter could cross and still have enough fuel to fight. Many of us who have spent time around machinery understand the tyranny of the fuel gauge. It is the ultimate arbiter of what is possible. The German pilots knew that while the heavy American B-17s would keep coming, they would eventually be forced to fly naked, stripped of their escorts as the P-47s and Spitfires hit their bingo fuel limits and turned for home. But this sense of security was a fragile ghost. The little friends, as the bomber crews affectionately called them, were about to undergo a biological evolution of sorts. In early 1944, German aces looking through their armored glass didn't just see the familiar silhouette of a fighter, they saw the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. It wasn't just another plane, it was a paradigm shift. Where there was once a ceiling, there was now a void. The German pilots realized that the safe sky had vanished, replaced by a predator that didn't have to turn back. The math had changed, and with it, the fate of the Reich. To understand the sudden, cold shock that hit the German High Command in 1944, we have to look at the map through the eyes of a Luftwaffe strategist. War, at its core, is a game of logistics and geography, and for years the Germans held the ultimate home field advantage. They operated behind what they considered a 600-mile tether. This wasn't just a distance, it was a physical law of the sky. They knew the American Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire were formidable machines, but they also knew these planes were thirsty. Like a dog on a short leash, they could only reach so far before the fuel gauge dictated a retreat. Many of us remember the old rule of thumb from our younger days working on engines. Power costs displacement, and displacement costs fuel. The Allied fighters were high-performance thoroughbreds, but their internal tanks were small. By the time a B-17 formation reached the outskirts of the German border, their escorting little friends were hitting their point of no return. They had to wiggle their wings in a bittersweet salute and turn back toward the English Channel. Because of this limitation, the Luftwaffe pilots developed a predatory patience. They didn't even bother attacking the bombers while they were under escort. Why risk a dogfight with a P-47 when you could simply wait for the clock to run out? They would sit on their airfields, sipping coffee and watching the radar, knowing that once that 600-mile tether snapped, the American heavies would be left entirely alone. Over the skies of Berlin, deep in the heart of the Reich, the German pilots felt like kings in a castle with an unscalable wall. They believed the interior of Germany was a sanctuary where the American fighter could never, physically, mathematically, intervene. This sense of invincibility wasn't based on superior skill, it was based on a fundamental assumption about the limits of a single-engine plane. The German High Command was certain the Americans were playing by the same rules of engagement that had governed the air for decades. They were convinced the math was on their side, right up until the moment it wasn't. In the world of aviation, weight is usually the enemy. We've all seen it in our own lives, whether it's an overloaded truck struggling up a grade or a boat sitting too low in the water. For a fighter pilot, extra weight traditionally meant a sluggish climb and a death sentence in a dogfight. Therefore, the German Luftwaffe assumed the Americans would never compromise the P-51's sleek aerodynamics by strapping massive, ungainly fuel tanks to its wings. It was a logical conclusion, but it was one that failed to account for the American spirit of field-expedient engineering. The gamble wasn't just about a new plane, it was about the drop tank. These were essentially pressurized aerodynamic extra lungs filled with 75 to 110 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Many of us remember the simple genius of the external fuel tank on a tractor or a long-haul generator. The idea is to use that fuel first, then discard the container when it's empty. The Americans took this concept to the extreme. By mounting these paper or steel tanks under the Mustang's wings, they effectively moved the border of the war. The pilot would take off from England, climb to altitude, and drain every drop from those external tanks while crossing the Channel and the Low Countries. By the time they reached the iron ceiling where the Germans expected them to turn back, the Mustang pilots didn't wave goodbye. Instead, they flipped a lever, jettisoned the empty tanks, and suddenly, like a weightlifter dropping his barbell, they were flying a clean, light, and lethal fighter deep inside German airspace. This was the 100-gallon gamble. The Americans were betting that the Mustang, even with the added drag of the tanks during the ferry flight, could still outpace the Meg 109 once the tanks were gone. It was a mechanical sleight of hand. The German radar operators started seeing blips over places like Brunswick and Magdeburg, areas that should have been escort-free zones. The reality on the ground was even sobering. This wasn't just a temporary raid or a lucky break, it was a permanent relocation of the front line. The Mustang hadn't just bypassed that 600-mile tether, it had cut the leash entirely. Those little friends weren't leaving the bomber's side as the fuel lights flickered. In fact, they were just getting started, having brought enough fuel to stay for the duration of the fight and pursue the Luftwaffe all the way back to their hangars. The consequence of that fuel gamble was a sudden, violent inversion of the natural order in the skies over Germany. For years, the Luftwaffe's Abfangjäger, the interceptor groups, had operated like a fire department. They would wait for the alarm, climb to a superior altitude, and then dive down upon the lumbering B-17 flying fortresses at their leisure. They were the hunters, choosing the time and place of the kill. But as the Mustang dropped its tanks over central Germany, that entire tactical manual was tossed into the slipstream. The German pilots began to notice something unsettling in their rearview mirrors. Those silver specks weren't just staying with the bombers, they were breaking formation and aggressively hunting the hunters. Many of us who grew up in the rural U.S. understand the shift that happens when a predator realizes it's being stalked. It's a primal change in the atmosphere. The Luftwaffe, once the masters of high-altitude ambush, suddenly found themselves boxed in. The very tactics that had once made the German Me-109 and FW-190 so deadly now became the instrument of their downfall. To bring down a massive B-17, the Germans had been forced to pack their planes with heavy 20 and 30mm cannons, along with thick layers of extra armor plating. These Sturmjäger, or storm fighters, had become flying tanks, deadly against a bomber, certainly, but sluggish and clumsy the moment a Mustang jumped them from 30,000 feet. The American pilots weren't just playing a defensive game anymore, they were engaging in ultimate pursuit. They began clearing the skies miles ahead of the bomber stream, catching the German interceptors while they were still struggling to form up, or even worse, while they were at their most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The payoff for the American crews was immediate and visible. For the first time in years, the bomber boys looked out their plexiglass windows and saw a sky filled not with black puffs of flak and the silhouettes of the enemy, but with the distinctive sleek lines of North American aviation. A single sobering statistic from the spring of 1944 tells the whole story. Luftwaffe pilot losses began to exceed their replacement rate. It wasn't because they lacked the industrial capacity to build planes, it was because they were losing their most experienced expectant in these lopsided dogfights. The skill they had spent years refining simply couldn't compete with the new reality of the air. This was the day the hunter truly became the prey. The Germans were forced to fly into a meat grinder just to reach the bombers they were supposed to be defending their homes from. They were no longer fighting a war of attrition, they were fighting a war of extinction. Every time a German pilot pulled the trigger on a B-17, he had to wonder if a Mustang was already lining up a deflection shot on his own tail. The psychological tether had snapped just as surely as the physical one. Experience is usually a pilot's greatest armor. In the early years of the war, a German Experten with 2,000 hours in a Messerschmitt was virtually untouchable. These men had survived the Spanish Civil War and the Battle of Britain. They knew every vibration of their airframe. But in the spring of 1944, that wealth of experience met a cold, mechanical reality that no amount of skill could overcome. The veteran German pilots began to realize that the P-51 Mustang wasn't just another adversary, it was a generational leap that made their beloved Me-109s feel like relics of a bygone era. Many of us who have worked with machinery for decades know that heartbreaking moment when a trusted tool simply reaches its physical limit. No matter how much you tune the carburetor or sharpen the blade, the design itself can no longer keep up with a modern successor. This was the fatal realization. The Me-109, for all its legendary status, was a 1930s design with a narrow landing gear and a cramped cockpit. It was built for short, sharp stabs at the enemy. The Mustang was the product of an entirely different philosophy. Its laminar flow wing meant it could cut through the air with significantly less drag, allowing it to dive faster and stay stable at speeds that would cause a Messerschmitt's controls to lock up like a rusted winch. Because of this aerodynamic advantage, the German veterans found themselves in a terrifying predicament. They could neither outrun the Mustang nor outturn it at high altitudes. A specific, chilling realization began to spread through the Luftwaffe mess halls. If a Mustang got on your tail, you didn't dogfight your way out. You prayed for a cloud bank, or you bailed out. The veteran pilots, the very backbone of the German defense, were being picked off not necessarily by superior pilots, but by a superior machine that had rendered their lifelong expertise obsolete. They weren't just losing a battle, they were witnessing the extinction of their era of flight. For those of us who appreciate the fine-tuned mechanical symphony of a high-performance engine, the sound of the Rolls-Royce Merlin is unmistakable. It isn't just noise, it's a rhythmic, guttural roar that signaled the end of the 1,000-year Reich. When the P-51 Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine echoed over the German countryside, it wasn't just announcing a tactical victory, it was announcing a legacy of total air supremacy that would define Western military doctrine for the next 80 years. The true measure of this story isn't found in a tally of downed aircraft, but in the silence that followed. By the time the war reached its closing chapters, the Luftwaffe had been effectively erased from the sky, grounded not just by a lack of fuel, but by a lack of surviving pilots who could match the Mustang's reach. History suggests that while the heavy bombers broke the back of German industry, it was the arrival of the Mustang that truly broke the German spirit. It was the realization that no matter where they hid or how high they climbed, the little friends would be there waiting. We often look back on the greatest generation with a sense of awe, but we must also remember the machines that carried them. The Mustang proved that American ingenuity, paired with a refusal to accept the iron ceiling, could turn the tide of a global catastrophe. Today, when we see a P-51 at an airshow, we aren't just looking at a vintage plane. We are hearing the echo of the day that Tether snapped and the sky finally belonged to the free. History isn't just a collection of dates and tail numbers, it's a legacy that belongs to all of us. If you found value in this deep dive into the mechanics of the air war, I'd be honored if you join our community. Subscribe and follow along as we continue to dust off the stories that defined a generation. If you or someone in your family served, or if you remember the sound of a Merlin engine at an airshow, please leave a comment below. Your perspectives are the real purple value of this channel. And if you think a friend or a fellow veteran would appreciate this look at the Mustang's gamble, share it with them. It helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for your time, and for keeping the history of the greatest generation close to heart.